processes that are not well structured for what the application is designed to do. When you're doing these things, you actually have to kind of walk away and not be afraid of having that change conversation around your process, because the whole intent is you want your infrastructure to scale and grow. But if you're too afraid of that change management aspect and changing the way you do things, it's going to ultimately encourage that tech debt to grow. And then it's going to be a lot harder for you to rationalize, because getting people to change their perspective on how they want to do the work is going to become increasingly more challenging.
Thank you, Erica, for joining. We're just super excited to have you here. We're just very much looking forward to having the larger conversation on data strategy and some of the core components of that. We had a phenomenal conversation earlier, and so I just enjoyed that. And I'm looking forward to being able to just kind of talk to you about data strategy. First off, if you wouldn't mind kind of giving like a 2-minute ordeal on your perception of data strategy and how to make sure it's effectually done in an organization. And then we'll kind of jump into the details that we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. So from my perspective, data strategy, and I think most organizations should have a data strategy these days, if they don't now. Data strategy is effectively looking and staring down at all the applications, data warehouses that your organization might maintain, manually captured data points. We sometimes call them end user computing solutions. But fundamentally, looking at your architecture and then looking at your aspirations as an organization, and then understanding what do you need to do with that data to enable your organization to meet whatever your growth objective is or your sales objective is, and allows your organization to scale. Now, for a newer organization, this is probably going to be a lot easier of a task, because you're standing up your data infrastructure as you're growing your organization. So your data strategy can be a lot more flexible and agile, and you can implement it into practice a lot faster. For larger or longer term organizations, this one can be a bit of a challenge from my perspective, because you have a legacy of applications that you might have inherited or have stood up. You might not have thought earlier on in your organizational lifespans about the integration of these systems, how they need to communicate with each other so that you can do the things that you need to do from an analytics perspective organizationally. And so those data strategies tend to be far more challenging, because there's an element of reconciliation that needs to happen in terms of organizationally what you need and what you don't need. And then how does that strategy enable it? And then what are the subcomponents that you need to do to get you from point A to point B? And how many years do you think that will reasonably take? Because it's going to require investment and some rationalization. And depending on the size of your organization, you might be able to fund it quickly, or it might be a longer term exercise based on other activities that you have going on. So having a fairly strong data strategy, I think, is very critical for any organization that's touching or using that information to do outreach to customers, marketing, or just understanding the health of your organization.
Right. So then part of that data strategy is also like an execution plan, right? So it's like, hey, look, our current staff is our current staff. We have our existing needs. And so then we're going to have to scale, right? So we're going to have to say, okay, like year one, we have to kind of like accomplish these things in order to get the credence and the budgeting and the approval from the organization so they can see the value proposition of going down this, right? So one of the things I noticed in what you were saying is that each organization is its own breed. Like, it's going to have its own unique peculiarities. The questions that need to be asked are going to be unique and specific to the company. What type of industry they're in, what type of size they're in, what type of history they have, how many different legacy systems are they maintaining, right? Like, what are some of the other core questions that come to your mind that help somebody kind of really know the environment that they're in, so as they're planning their data strategy, they can have a much better kind of paradigm to properly assess how to build out that strategy?
So when I work with folks, and when I've worked on projects in the past, and projects are a really great example, because the questions that you ask when you stand up an application are very much, in my opinion, the same questions that you should ask when you're building out your strategy. What do you need today? And what do you have today that you want to keep? What are the things that you don't have today that you need? from a data perspective? And then what are the things that you're going to anticipate that you might be? And that one is a little bit more nebulous. You might not know, you may know, but it's good to at least try and kick the can down the road a little bit to try and be forward thinking. And then the thing that wraps it all around is, what is the technology that you're going to use to interact with your data? Now, smaller organizations, they might go to cloud right away. They might be focusing on on-prem activities. They'll use an Alteryx or Snowflake or some other tool, Python. And then for those that are cloud, then it becomes the question of, okay, with that in mind, do we have that data flowing into it, and can we expose it? And then ask the questions of, for the things that we have, is it flowing into your target state? For the things that we don't have, can we get it to flow? Do we have it already? And then for the things that we think we might need, the same question. And then your strategy can solve for the immediate needs, the potential needs, the future needs, but it also ring fences the problem areas that you need to fix from a strategic exec perspective, so that you can round out your data so that you can do those things, or at least you have a plan to get to the things that are missing, so that you can really have a robust data infrastructure and be able to really agilely ask questions and get them answered with the data that you have at your fingertips.
Got it. So you're saying that some of those core questions is, what is your tech stack, and what tech stack are you planning on having, right?
Yep.
So, okay. And then how much of that do you feel is looking at the tech stack of the actual organization? Like, not so much the data tech stack, but the organizational. So if they have, let's suppose there was an organization from acquisitions and they've merged together or whatever, and like, are some of the questions centered around, like, do you have multiple ERPs? Do you have, like, what type of CRM environment? Like, how much of those questions come into play? Like, what type of business software products are within the organization? Obviously, those are like sources of data, but how much of that is an element for you?
I think it's a pretty critical element, and the criticality of it as an element is a kind of a slide scale depending on the maturity of your organization. So, like, let's talk about the acquisition. Let's just say that you're in an organization that's had 3 to 4 acquisitions. You didn't necessarily have a data architecture model in mind as to how you wanted your infrastructure to look. And so each acquisition was effectively a series of decisions as to what source systems we want to keep because of the functionality, or it, delivers a certain level of customer service that your customer expects. So they don't want to deviate from that. They want to keep that value proposition. Okay, fine. But after 4 acquisitions, you might have turned your data architecture into a Gordian knot. You may have systems that are doing duplicative things or don't interact well with one another, and you've stood up, manual processes to plug holes in functional gaps that the applications can't bridge. In those moments, having that rationalization conversation turns into be a pretty important exercise, because the thing that often happens in those scenarios is that when you have that much tech debt, you also have to pay the expense of the upkeep of those applications. Right. And so rationalizing them down into a more simplified environment, really staring down some of those processes and challenging yourself organizationally to say, should I even be doing it this way in the first place, I think is absolutely essential. I have seen in the past scenarios in which when applications get established and decisions get made, sometimes it's not about the capabilities of the application and how it uplifts you organizationally, but it's really just, let's get the application because we need to replace the old one, but we want it to still do the same process. And sometimes what that results in is over customization, under customization, really, processes that are not well structured for what the application is designed to do. When you're doing these things, you actually have to kind of walk away and not be afraid of having that change conversation around your process, because the whole intent is you want your infrastructure to scale and grow. But if you're too afraid of that change management aspect and changing the way you do things, it's going to ultimately encourage that tech debt to grow. And then it's going to be a lot harder for you to rationalize, because getting people to change their perspective on how they want to do the work is going to become increasingly more challenging.
Right. So then, I mean, from like a data strategy perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, how do you like in that situation? You have um, an environment where you have a handful of mergers or acquisitions. I think we used four in this example.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see like the contrast of like using a data mesh versus data centralization? I mean, it seems like that's a that's one of those like that's a perfect example to kind of step back and say, okay, where are the questions that need to be asked when looking forward on building a data strategy in this merger organization, merged organization.
So I think whether you choose data centralization or using a data mesh with a combination of data products, and if you want to overlay that with data domains, I think it's functionally a decision of what you're using the data for. So let's just say, you know, you're a bank and you need to send out instructed regulatory reports. In that case, it might be beneficial to build a centralized repository, source all the data in, and standardize it so that you can just get your instructed reports out in a recurring fashion. There's very little change. You know, there's governance that has to happen to make sure that all your elements are up to code and they're providing
Right.
the right outputs. But on a whole, it's one function. So centralization makes sense because you don't have to do a lot of upkeep other than making sure all of the widgets are flowing in correctly. Now, if you're trying to do things that are a little bit more dynamic, you have, you know, the use cases might ebb and flow. Data products might be more optimal, right? You could funnel all of your data into, let's say, a cloud environment, and then you can decide what data you actually need. And the interesting thing about data products, and depending how an organization tries to structure it, is you can continue to add, remove, adjust that depending on how you structure your data product environment. You could do it by different business areas, and you have your marketing data products, and that's going to encompass sensitive information, not just about your customer base, but also prospects and things you'll need to do for outreach. You could do it for your sales and have customized data products for those based on all of the elements that they need. But it allows it to be a little bit more agile, and you can make changes a little bit faster in a data product environment than I think you could in a centralized model, because in a centralized model, oftentimes you have a number of stakeholders. They need to agree as to the changes. If you can't get agreements, then it kind of dies on the vine. But I think it's situational. And it also depends on the size of your organization and the things that you're looking to do that come from that strategy.
Right. So some of the core questions, if I'm hearing you correctly, and you just tell me if I'm framing this right, is um, the level of regulatory nature. The higher organization is bound by regulatory reporting or of any kind, right? So whether that be financial or whatever, the higher likelihood that a centralized environment is going to be a better model fit from a data strategy perspective. And your data mesh is going to be better fit for the very dynamic, changing paradigms of an organization. So if the organization's business processes is very inconsistent and kind of wanting to do and try new things, and then a data product environment is going to be much better, because then now you can have people stand up data products and interdepartmentally be able to leverage those for their own use cases and needs.
Yes. And
Do
the
you
other
think
opportunity,
sizing is like a big factor in this, or no? Do you think do you think that um, the size of an organization or the maturity of an organization is a factor? So like the age, if size and age type of demographics.
um, I think the age and the size of an organization is going to dictate the speed at which you can move and develop. If you have it, so if you have a small, young organization, like I said earlier, you can build from the ground up and you can nail the execution at the jump and set your architecture up at scale at the beginning. If you're an older, more well established organizations, you have tons of different data assets and source systems that you're using, it could take longer, right? Because organizationally, you might have to decide what's the authoritative source I want to use for something and have agreements on that from a data product perspective, and then make sure that those are the things that are flowing through so that you can start to kind of build out the requirements that'll feed your data requirements. So I do think that it does play a part, but it is again kind of a slide scale based on the size and the tenure that the organization has been around, and how well they've kind of maintained and curated, and in some cases pruned their data architecture. The more complex the architecture, I think, the more challenging it becomes, because then it's so much more information that you have to churn through to figure out what is good for the purpose that you need it for versus not. And that, I think, is another really critical question that you'd have to ask in your overall data strategy, is like, what are the sources of data that I need to do to get what I need to?
If you were to say like you would say that if you're giving counsel to somebody on doing that data strategy, if you're a young, small organization, you're not going to. Do you think that the question of data mesh versus data centralization is agnostic of those attributes? Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so.
Okay, so
I think so. But I do think when you're a young organization, think about what you want to be in 5 years. And think about how your tech stack might need to evolve. Think about how your data potentially is going to evolve. So I agree, at the beginning, it'll be agnostic. I think as they mature, that strategy will start to form the opinion of whether it needs to be centralized or not. But as long as you're caring for your strategy and really actively looking at it on an annual basis, you should be in a good position that you can refine your model as you go with little pain and little fuss associated with it.
Got it. So then, so if I'm hearing it correctly, it's more about business operations, right? So those are like your data strategy and your selection of even a data mesh versus data centralization is more predicated based off of the underlying operations of the organization. And with the maturity of the organization, the more defined that decision has to become.
Yes, I would think so.
Yeah. Awesome. So why don't we shift gears and talk a little bit more about like building good data products within an organization, and strategically your recommendations on how to go about doing that and doing it effectively.
And that's a really, really challenging question. And I quite literally had somebody ask me like what my thoughts on it were today. And it's challenging in the sense that I think it's really difficult to get it right 100% the first time. I've built pseudo data products over the many years that I've been an analytics practitioner, and there's kind of three ways that I think about it when you're building a data product. If you know specifically what you're building for and it has set requirements, it's easy. You can do it in your sleep. It's not a complicated exercise. It's when you're trying to create more of a broad scale use data product. There's the age old question of, do I just bring everything in and hope that works? And it might be a really clunky, huge table that you need to work with because there's a lot of data because you threw everything in the kitchen sink, where you use it or you approach it from a use case perspective. And you pick high value targets and you build your data products to meet those high value targets. And it could be 1,000 things as to what those use cases are. There's challenges in both of them. When you go all in, there's a lot of stuff that you're feeding into a data product view that you might not necessarily be using. Maintaining it might become difficult. It might reduce your costs, but to actually run it might run into its own set of challenges depending on how much you're putting in it. From a use case perspective, the challenges that I often see is just the language of use case. People look at, this is what's on fire in my world right now. This is the burning issue that I need to address. And then oftentimes you end up with this very hyper-focused end product that can only do one or two things because it was really designed for a singular idea.
Right.
I think the optimal approach in my mind, and what I've done in the past has been, what are all of the use cases? And I look at use cases broadly in the terms of what's burning for you right now that you are having trouble getting to, but also what are the foundational things that you need to do run your business on a day-to-day
Right.
basis, and collate all of those use cases, and then blend it with that all in approach and say, okay, these are all the things that I need to address the immediate need, but here are some of a few ancillary fields that I think are going to create value. And that really requires, strong data SMEs who understand what's in those fields and who have good contextual understanding of how that data could potentially be used in the business. And I think if you kind of blend those two approaches, you might be in a better position to have a more broadly usable data product. Because the other thing that you don't want to do in whatever your tech stack is you don't want to flood it with, hundreds of different data products, because then you're back to where you started with having kind of a complex architecture and you don't know where to go to get the right answer. So also having an overarching strategy to apply to your approach in terms of what are the categories of data products that I need to build. I think of it in a very simplistic way. Like from a banking perspective, it's transactions, accounts, customers, eventually households. You could have your HR profile, you could have a marketing one. Organizationally, you can alter that product view however you want to do it. But think about how many of those use cases you can logically combine that achieve synergy and create an authoritative source for you, so
Right.
that you're still creating a targeted, well curated data product landscape without flooding the market with specialty use cases.
Right. So taking the larger step back and saying, okay, how do I make this have as much scalable utility for the organization without it being which oftentimes happens is the initial request that precipitates something is unique and specific to that department, and even unique and specific to potentially an individual's role. And stepping further back, understanding their role, the department, and other departments that are likely to end up using those pieces or data, that data, right? And so trying to make more of like a staple like flour, where it can bake a cake or it can make a loaf of bread, and the what goes into it, it needs to be able to be dynamic into the future. While
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, anything you do add to it changes and limits what you can then turn it into, right? And um, so how do you make sure that when you're interfacing with the person who's made the initial request for a data product, or is the driver, the business stakeholder who's basically really pushing for it, and ensuring that it's being done in such a way that you have the latitude to get the rest of the organization and business larger design purview to make sure that it's serviceable across the organization.
So when I have built data products in the past, the question that I've always asked is, like, the foundational question is always, what exactly is it that you need? So, for example, I built a few years ago, I designed a data product that effectively reconciled all of our retail customers at a customer level. So it's a singular
Right.
table that we designed in a way where you can see distinct customers and you can see all their product holdings. And that was all they really cared about. We want to, look at customer deepening. How are we building and deepening our relationships? Okay, fine. I went and said, okay, let's talk about all the other things that you would want to know about that. Okay. The first step is how many accounts they have. Do you want to understand, you know, leading indicators for full customer attrition? Like when do you have to start reaching out if you start to see account closures, and what are the trends that we need to see there? Do you care about, how many people are on the account? Do you care about the balances that maintain? Do you care about the ancillary services that they support, that they receive, and understanding how engaged they are in whatever product or portfolio that you have them in? And I start to ask all of these questions because I put myself in the shoes of whoever is going to be doing the analysis, doing the readout, and saying, what are the other follow-on questions that I would ask if I saw an abnormality or what have you, and really start to kind of push it out and expand their thinking in terms of just that singular use case.
Right.
And then that starts to frame out all the other elements that you might want to bring in to the table or to the view, until you land on something that could answer multiple questions instead of one. And that's the key, is like understanding your partners and whomever is working with you on the design enough that you can ask those leading questions to lead them towards the broader requirements that you need. And then, layering in, okay, what other foundational data do you need that you would want to see at this level, and start to bake that in. And I think those are really good conversations, because it also, whoever the requester is, it pushes them to think outside of just the singularity of the ask and be a little bit more forward thinking in terms of, oh, okay, well, once I get this question asked, then I'm probably going to want to ask this right after. Well, let's deal with it all up front. It'll be all at your fingertips. Then we can put self-serve in front of it. We'll give you a dashboard, and you can toggle through as much as you want, and you won't even have to come and ask me the question. Like that, I think is the ideal target state. But it's asking those right questions to get there, so that you can really turn your organization to self-serve for scale, whatever it is your ambition is.
Yeah, one of my favorite questions is what are some of the business processes or practices that you're trying to accomplish? And so when you're trying to accomplish it, what are some of the things that you wish you knew or had in order to accomplish those things? And then it really kind of enables you to really truly understand what is the facility and purpose of their department within the larger ecosystem of the organization. And so then you can basically really drill down and be like, okay, now when certain elements of your business process occur, there's other departments on the front and back end that are recipients and contributors to what you do, right? And so then it also enables you to then have the follow-up questions of like, hey, let's go talk to them and see if we were to do this, how much would that improve their life? And then they answer those same questions or ask those same questions, and now that you have enveloped a much larger paradigm and scope of, if I put these things in, I know tomorrow XYZ department's going to end up using it, and then they're going to be like, well, I really wish we would have had ABC. And so, yeah.
And that is a really fantastic and a fundamental question. And more so to the earlier point, right? When you're a young organization and you're building your data, like that is the thing that should be your guiding principle with everything that you do, for every application, every source system, every website that you establish, asking yourself those questions when you're doing it. Now, when we go back to that acquisition example, I don't know that organizations consistently do a good job of asking that question. And a lot of times they'll take down an application and a bunch of things will break, and then everybody panics over how to fix it. So asking that question, not even at the data product level, but at the foundational, we're standing up the system or we're replacing the system, is actually really important. Because the other thing that I've observed over the many years that impedes the data strategy is that lift and shift mentality. Well, we only need it to do what it needs today. We just need to update the tool, or we need to switch the application. And a lot of the times they don't see it as an opportunity to reevaluate, are they even getting the data outputs that they need to effectively manage and have oversight over their organization. And I think that's it's a critical question to ask even at that point. And making sure you have all your data partners engaged, your reporting folks engaged, your upstream process users engaged, so that they can also opine and say, these are the other things that I need, so that it makes your data product build out a lot easier when you're considering it at the initiation point of data creation versus trying to solve for it in post. Because I think that becomes a more challenging exercise.
Right. Yeah. I mean, nothing's worse than trying to do something after the fact, right? And If you can get it right the first time, you've obviously nominalized the volume of technical debt, right?
Yes.
And so then it's no longer just um, and at the same time, like I love this idea of what I call like creating a frontier where you allow people to kind of frontier and find out the things that need to be included, especially if you have like a more centralized model. This is where this kind of fits. Um, then you allow them to do it, and then if you're doing a proper architecture, it takes longer to get it into the centralized model and integrate it in, and whether that be having to get all the sign off and approvals from all the stakeholders that hey, we're going to be bringing in these data elements or whatever, allowing frontier work to occur where they're going and creating small data products that then get developed into a larger centralized model. Um, and so, um, and it allows the business to be dynamic, which it is, but still like not having the rigidity, if that makes sense, of, okay, we missed these 10 things. Well, if you have a like kind of an SDLC process of your data products, you can do it in that fashion, right? And then you allow those frontier items to die on the vine if they're just not very valuable, right? Or if it's like, whoa, these are really valuable, okay, well, these need to be integrated in. Um, this is again on the more like centralized model, but it's kind of a unique strategy. And
But it's definitely an interesting concept, and it allows, I like it because it allows an organization to prototype what they think they need and
right,
if it actually creates value.
exactly.
So I it's fascinating. I like it.
Well, it solves a problem of like the data team's too slow, so we're
Mm.
just gonna build all these hodgepodge solutions that creates more technical debt for the IT team to unwind, and obviously begets an even slower output. So if you enable them to actually do that work and being able to um, produce products that they have in a very like disciplined manner that's carved out, they can be nimble, and then it can be integrated into a larger environment. And so you have a whole process on how that works, and you define it out, and it ends up becoming an environment where you can have. Again, this is more for centralized model. This is not necessarily like a data mesh type of environment, but it's something that I've found to be very successful in creating that kind of SDLC process where you give the nimble nature to the business, and then you give the centralized data quality transformed full version that is has utility across the organization. So
And I think that that makes sense. I think even to a certain extent, you probably could do it with data products where you have the right BSAs, right analysts in an environment where they get to prototype with
yeah,
data to
yeah,
decide, oh, this looks good. This is what I need. And then you can have the conversation of, do we embed it into an existing data product and then we just put it through that
yep,
development life cycle where they realign it to meet the standards and the appropriate governance of whatever your tech stack is, or they build a standalone data product. Because the other challenge that I see, right, is the dependence on tech to design. And what tech often lacks, and rightfully, to a certain extent, rightfully so, like they might not have business context. Like they're meant to just receive requirements oftentimes, and then it's just like we go build. But having somebody who blends that technical and that business
yeah,
context and they can prototype it, sometimes that increases your speed to market. And to your point, then you don't necessarily have to hear that age old, well, data's not moving fast enough, or we're not
yep,
getting to what we need fast enough. And I think it's a little bit of a combined effort
yeah.
with those folks. But it also depends on your organization, how many people you have in good position with that blend of skills to be able to
Well,
do that
that so
prototyping.
so the way that I've done it in the past is that you actually set up SMEs
Hmm.
within a respective department, and you put those SMEs in isolated training. So you'll take them for an hour once a week for a period of like 5 to 8 weeks or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and you have them go through and you do the training on how enabling them to build their own their own data elements, right? And then once those are done, now those SMEs, you obviously work it out with the within their departments some sort of like incentive to be that SME, right? And so then now that person can tell you and raise a hand and say, hey, a lot of the problem that we're having is because of these factors, these data quality issues, these these data elements are missing, and then they can start generating them and getting them going. So that's why I said, like, you have to build a whole process for this to work, and part of that process is upskilling certain individuals within an organization, and you may end up finding that they're your next data engineer, or your next data analyst, or whatever, and or report developer for BI person, or normally you don't see them transition into a data science role. But you see my point is that, like, by giving them the tools, giving them the training, it's a methodology that I've seen work and scale, and enable the business to have a very good close parity with a centralized data model.
And I think that that makes sense. And then to kind of bring it back to your data strategy, that's probably another thing that you have to factor in. So not just what you need your data for, where you want to be or what you want to be when you grow up, so to speak, and what your tech stack is, but also looking at your talent mix. Is your talent mix
Of
complementary
course.
to where you want to go as an organization? And if it's not, what do you have to do to uplift, move, transition effectively shift that talent mix so that it moves at scale with your tech stack and your data feeds? It's all of this kind of composite view, and it's I think it's three challenging spaces that require their own different set of attention. But I think that if you put the right things in place, put the right training, change management, put the right considerations, and I think ultimately you'll be successful. It's just overall, you're going to have to care for it very carefully and keep a close eye on it as the strategy starts to get executed. And
Right.
be prepared to be adaptable to changes in the environment that might cause your strategy to shift, because that's the other thing too, is like you have to build in a certain degree of flexibility that if something goes sideways or suddenly your CEO announces you're acquiring another bank, like have some element of flexibility in your data strategy so that you can pivot at that moment. And what that looks like, I think, is situational based on your organization. But I do think that that's another critical factor to bring to bear, especially as it relates to what you'll eventually do as you start to build out data products or a centralized data model. Or in some cases, you might wind up finding that you need a combination of the two.
Agreed. Yeah, and I don't think like we started the conversation. I've appreciated so much from you is um, each organization is entirely different, and its needs and how you can service them with a proper data strategy is going to be no two data strategies should look identical. Um, and I couldn't agree more. I think that uh, you have to treat each organization within the paradigm of their own circumstances and their own business processes and operations. And um, so thank you so much, Erica. Really appreciate the conversation, and um, again, just really appreciate you kind of going over data strategy and how to make sure that it's defined for an organization, and giving some of the viewers those questions that'll really help them unveil that for their own organization.
Absolutely. It was absolutely fantastic to be invited. I'm super chuffed over it.
Yeah, so thank you.